Hello and welcome to this webinar sponsored by Bioinformatics and IMV, part of the Science and Medicine Group. My name is Matt Clusis. We'll be talking to you today about disruptors in the medical imaging industry. For this webinar, we completed a survey of 147 radiologists, and we'll be talking to you about some of the insights that have come out of that survey throughout this presentation. At the highest level, we'd call out two major themes. The first is the importance of reimbursement changes, both appropriate use criteria as well as value-based medicine. That stood out as the most important disruptor in the medical imaging industry today. The other is an approaching instrument purchase cycle. Our research indicates that nearly a third of all existing imaging instruments could be replaced within the next 2 years. We'll talk about some of the other disruptors as we move through the presentation. Let's take a step back and talk a little bit about the imaging market. On the left-hand side, you can see a buildup of all of the different types of imaging technology we'll be looking at through this presentation. In 2017, there were over 63,000 units, with the highest contributor being ultrasounds, followed by X-rays. In terms of market share of suppliers, you can see on the right-hand side, GE and Siemens control over half the market, followed by Philips, Toshiba, and Konica Minolta. As we look at replacement cycles, the IMV data suggests that most of these technologies are switched out every between 10 to 12 years. If we use that metric as a measurement to look at the existing stock of imaging equipment on the right-hand side, you can see that approximately 30, let's call it 25 to 35% of these different technologies are approaching that 10 to 12 year replacement cycle, which is why we conclude that nearly a third of existing imaging instruments in the field today could be switched out within the next couple of years. Let's now look at all of the disruptions that we took a look at. This is using the structure, conduct, performance framework. First, we'll start with structure. In terms of economic supply, we see artificial intelligence, particularly in radiology, coming to the fore in a variety of different ways. We'll talk about some of the near-term implementations as well as some of the long-term aspirations. We'll touch briefly on digital pathology, both in terms of its utilization as well as its availability in the field. Under conduct, we can talk about appropriateness measures toward eliminating unnecessary testing, how that's being built into the system, and some of the ramifications moving forward. Under performance, we'll talk about value-based medicine transitioning from fee-for-service reimbursement models. And then finally, we'll talk to you about an interesting technological change where we have the use of positron emission tomography, or PET, being now deployed into cardiac imaging with the potential to prevent the need for invasive diagnostic methods that are currently in use. Finally, we'll talk about an external shock. So in this framework, external shocks typically relate to regulation. So we'll talk to you about the first U.S. FDA approval of a whole slide imaging system, as well as some of the new tariffs that are a very hot topic right now and have the potential to really change the dynamics of the industry over the next several years. So we asked our panel of 147 radiologists to rank these various disruptions. On this slide, you can see what their answers came back with. So again, appropriateness of care and value-based medicine were 1 and 2, followed by artificial intelligence. FDA approvals and digital pathology were after that. Interestingly, tariffs were the lowest ranked among these disruptors, and we'll talk about why that may be today and how that may change into the future. Let's focus on appropriateness. The Choosing Wisely campaign, which was started back in 2012 in the U.S., has since expanded to over 20 countries worldwide in 2018. We can look at some of the early studies that have tried to examine the impact of appropriateness measures on the utilization of imaging technologies on the right-hand side. We spoke to the author of a very interesting study out of San Antonio, Texas, where you can see they looked at these various technologies by both private payers and public payers in the United States. The utilization rates, this is an index from 2005. So if 2005 would be 100%, these numbers relate to where those numbers landed in 2014 relative to that 2005 value. You can see quite a bit in the commercial HMO market for CT, MRI, and plain film, where the utilization came down pretty substantially, nearly 50% or 40%. For Medicare, you can see most of these technologies still hovering at 75% or above of their use back in 2005. So definitely some variance here by payer. So let's talk about the impact across these technologies. The data on the left here is from Medicare Part B procedures per 1,000 beneficiaries. So again, this is an indexed value. Here looking at 2004, where the index value would be 100, and we go out to 2016. You can see a very steep decline in both the use of ultrasound technology as well as plain film X-ray. MRI and CT actually grew over the first few years of this period, but then started to decline and ended up approximately at the same level they were at in 2004. Now, there are two factors that lead us to believe that appropriateness is going to be an important disruption moving forward. The first is the use of radiology benefit management companies, which are implementing new checks on imaging orders. Now, that typically manifests in the second factor, which is the software that providers use for these imaging technologies. Appropriateness measures are being built into the algorithms of this software in such a way that providers will have to check the box essentially to make sure that that particular use for a particular patient meets those appropriateness criteria. And as that's rolled out, even more so over the next several years, we feel that could have a real impact. Also regulation with MACRA, not mackerel like the fish, but this is an acronym for a piece of legislation we'll talk about in a little bit. That is also incenting the movement towards some of these computer-based algorithm systems to not only support the provider in the use of these technologies, but also to implement these types of appropriateness measures as they consider the appropriate use for a particular patient. Next, we'll talk about value-based medicine. So historically, especially in the United States, the model used to be fee-for-service. Recent legislation, again, this MACRA legislation in 2015, established some significant financial incentives to move to value-based payments. At the top of the chart here, you can see a pretty substantial impact, where traditional fee-for-service in 2015 went from 62% of U.S. healthcare payments to 43% in a single year. Now, we all know that the healthcare industry tends to move slow. That's a pretty dramatic shift in a single year. You can see both pay-for-performance as well as value-based payments kind of offsetting that decline to a certain extent. So there are questions around the extent to which imaging professionals, quote-unquote, drive the volume as opposed to external factors. But nevertheless, this is an important consideration as we look at different ways to reimburse the coverage of really all imaging technologies that are in use today. Let's talk about reimbursement impacts on revenue and volume. So we asked our panel about the impact to their business from both value-based payments as well as appropriate use criteria. And you can see the results here. Most of the changes reported are kind of in the no change to a slight, 2 to 9% decrease as a result of both of these measurements. You can see value-based payments are tending to drag down revenue, at least as reported by this panel, slightly more than appropriate use criteria. Interestingly, only 55% of respondents feel they understand how value-based payments are calculated. There's still some confusion in the market in terms of what providers need to do to essentially align with the incentives to drive the volume and the revenue in their business most appropriately under this scheme. Next, we're going to talk about the technological change I alluded to earlier. The use of PET in cardiac imaging is beginning to build momentum, and as we look out a few years, we really think that this is an important trend to look at from a technological perspective. Some PET utilization rates, you can see at the bottom there, are reporting 90% or above. Now, why is that important? Well, the use of PET can help eliminate unnecessary diagnostic catheterizations to focus on revascularization therapies. In one case study at Intermountain Health, the use of PET reduced these procedures by about 10%, which again, if you're looking at it from a patient's perspective, the use of an imaging technology as opposed to an invasive diagnostic method, there's a lot of advantages to that. And we think that this technology and this trend could have a lot of momentum as we move into the next few years. Let's talk about artificial intelligence in radiology. This is a hot topic across industries. Imaging is no exception. There's a lot of potential for artificial intelligence to be used in both the evaluation of imaging results as well as the use of other steps along the workflow for imaging professionals. A lot of studies are coming out trying to compare the results generated by artificial intelligence in the specific area of interpretation relative to, let's say, an expert panel. So you can see on the right-hand side a few studies that have been put out there. In one study, it was about a 91% accuracy rate for the artificial intelligence. In another study, it was about 87% in this BioMind AI system. I believe this is out of China. And that's, again, comparing to a panel of MD experts. We talked to some of the leaders that are actually on the front lines of developing artificial intelligence in radiology about their perceptions of where it is today, where it can be soon, and what the long-term opportunities are for AI. Near term, I think the consensus among the group is that it's certainly not ready for interpretation of images anytime soon, but you could see AI deployed for other tasks in the, let's say, radiologist workflow. So that could be order optimization, post-dictation analytic corrections, things that are more transactional in nature, but could really be a labor-saving activity for the average radiologists. In the medium term, they do see a sweet spot for AI in terms of eliminating other aspects of the job that are quite onerous for radiologists today. And that could be things like counting lesions on a chest CT. If AI could automate that in such a way that could save time and aggregate it over, let's say, a radiologist's total volume in a year, that could be a pretty material savings. When you talk to, again, the leaders looking at artificial intelligence about the long term, they certainly believe that the technology will eventually get there where interpretation and diagnostic applications of AI will be possible. However, they do point out some barriers potentially that still exist today. So one is solving some of the non-random noise in the interpretation. That's something, again, that they believe they will be able to work out, but it's going to take some time. And then secondly, there are regulatory, or let's call them administrative challenges to deal with in terms of HIPAA compliance and enabling wide-scale adoption across an institution with the information technology tools that are at the disposal of most institutions. When we talk to them about the providers of these technologies and ask them, what would you ask the providers to focus on to help you continue to pioneer the use of AI in radiology? One key opinion leader asked us for good infrastructure for data importation. They were not as focused on slick software packages that make everything look nice. They're really focused on the basic infrastructure that's going to allow them to do this work. So again, we asked our panel, what are the areas of artificial intelligence as you look at the workflow that you're most excited about? Where do you think the greatest impact will lie? And not surprisingly, almost half of the panel felt that detection and interpretation of findings was the area where AI could have the greatest impact. You can see some of the other downstream steps that we've talked about there below. But when you ask them, do you think that detection and interpretation will be available within 5 years, you can see on the right-hand side, over 75% either agreed or strongly agreed with that statement. So again, you put that in the context of the experts that we talked to who feel that it's probably definitely beyond a 5-year time horizon. There could be a little bit of a disconnect in terms of some of the challenges that will be necessary for enabling AI to inform detection and interpretation of findings in radiology. Digital pathology tends to follow behind radiology. So pathology is kind of where radiology was, let's say maybe a decade or so ago. So here we're still talking about access to digital pathology and utilization. This is some data out of the United Kingdom. You can see here that 32% of pathologists are expected to retire in the next 5 years. So the advantages offered by digital pathology could have a real material impact in terms of labor savings, which will then manifest in potentially a reduced need for labor in a market that does tend to have some challenges attracting new labor into the space given all of the regulations. You can see in terms of who has access to digital pathology here on the left-hand side, there's still some work to be done. There are still some institutions that do not have access to digital pathology, and that's kind of highlighted on the bottom row there with the no. It's hovering somewhere between 40 to let's say 50% of institutions that still don't have access to digital pathology. So again, if radiology is a precursor to what we're likely to see in pathology, that will change probably pretty quickly over the next several years, but there's still some runway left to cover here. Let's talk about regulatory changes. So 3 that we're going to call out on this slide. Probably the most interesting for the imaging approval space was the April 2017 approval of the Philips and Telesight PIPS platform. This is the first whole slide imaging system that's been approved by the US FDA. Europe, I believe, has had approvals in this area at least for a little while. So as new technologies are able to come to the fore, this should be an important precursor for hopefully accelerating more approvals in this area. We've talked a little bit about the Consolidation Appropriations Act of 2016. Again, this is creating incentives for providers in terms of how they'll be reimbursed and how they're going to architect their business as a result of that. So you can see, for example, reduced reimbursement for the technical component of imaging analysis, and increases in payment for the professional component. So again, that's going to have implications for how the work is divided, where the work is done, and where the emphasis in terms of investment goes. And then finally, in the US, there's been a lot of talk about tariffs, an escalating trade war between the United States and various countries or groups such as the European Union. Medical imaging equipment is included in this, and we're going to talk a little bit in a second about the impact potentially of these tariffs on the purchase of medical imaging equipment. So let's focus on that for a second. The Medical Imaging and Technology Alliance put out a statement at the end of June of 2018 that came out very strongly against tariffs. And as you can see on the bottom of this slide, they even called out the fact that this is carrying the potential to actually move operations outside of the United States, which is certainly not the intended consequence of the tariffs that legislators are hoping for. You can see on the right-hand side that medical imaging equipment also includes some other components that are part of the tariff conversation. So aluminum and steel do come into these machines, which will then have to also be accounted for as well. So in terms of talking to leaders in the industry and the panel, there's a perception that tariffs will lead to a lot of very active pricing negotiation. We asked our panel, though, how do you expect tariffs to impact your purchases in 2019? You can see here that 67% of the respondents expected to either purchase as needed in 2019 or purchase but look to negotiate other elements if there's an impact to the tariffs. So a lot of people right now are expecting whatever tariffs come out to really come out in the wash. But unlike other industries like automakers, medical imaging providers, as of today, have not come out and said these tariffs will increase prices of medical imaging equipment by X dollars, X euros, whatever the case may be. So only 15% of the people in our panel said that the tariffs would impact their purchasing, but we're actually going to hold on this question for now. It'll be interesting to see if we ask this question in a year, once these tariffs have a way to work their way through the system, whether this holds or whether respondents really change the way that they view the tariffs, and as a result, how they are considering purchases of medical imaging equipment. That concludes our webinar today. Thank you so much for your time. If you'd like to learn more about our survey, you can contact Greg Thompson, Lauren, Christina, or myself to find out more, and also find out more about how we can develop custom surveys to answer specific questions to help your business. Have a great day.